So welcome to our second meetup of the year. Annika Keitz, I'm the co-organizer and curator of the Speculative Futures Berlin meetup. And before some admin, you might have seen it already. The session is being recorded for those who cannot be here today. And a little agenda. So as always, I'm going to give a little short introduction to Speculative Futures Berlin and our topics tonight. And then our first speaker, Jemma Battaglia, will present us her speculative design project, Pollutus Planta, after which Rasa Weber will take over and give us a talk on Algae Futures. And then in the end, we will sum up in a Q&A. All right, so Speculative Futures Berlin is part of the International Design Futures Initiative, which is based in San Francisco. And all over the world, we have different chapters. And here in Berlin, we are one of the largest chapters in Europe with over 2,200 members by now. And yeah, Speculative Futures Berlin is being run and operated by Algae Studios since 2017. That is a creative strategy agency. And at Algae, we are a team of future researchers, designers, and strategists. And our core mission is to help organizations shape transformation sustainably. And we do this through future studies, which is how we anticipate futures, design, with which we make information visible and understandable, and participation, where we try to enable communities to actually take action. And why are we running Speculative Futures Berlin as Algae Studio? We want to bring together actors who are currently busy creating the futures we wish for, how we call it also desirable futures. And we want to design a discourse and clarify that everyone can actually think about the future and shape it. And if you are curious about what we're doing, or all the topics that we also maybe do in the future, you can stay in contact with us via all these social channels. Stefan is going to share them with you in the chat. And yeah, so this brings me already to today's topic. There are many trends suggesting ideas about the futures of fashion. And I just wanted to give us a little look into some of the trends that are happening right now. And the big hype is digital fashion or digital clothing that can be bought for, let's say, an avatar when we're talking about the metaverse maybe, or for your social media profiles, also in the form of or in the form of NFTs, those non-fungible tokens. And it's seen or supposed to be a sustainable alternative to the pollution and waste problems that the fashion industry is facing. It's also made its way into couture now. And just to give you a glimpse how far-reaching this trend has been, Balenciaga, the fashion house, has even launched a collection on a popular online game platform, Fortnite. Another trend is edible fashion, where using fashionable clothing can actually be eaten. There's even an edible arts awards show. Then there's smart fashion, where, for example, here with these sensory socks, while you're running, not only your calorie count, your speed, your distance is tracked, but also your foot landing technique, your impact score, it's all being generated while you're running. Or here you have these smart wearable yoga pants that literally give you feedback to your body impulses while you're doing the poses on how you can maybe correct it and how you can deepen your practice. Obviously, the call for sustainable fashion, or some of the buzzwords are green design or sustainable design or circular design. And here's also a gallery on bio-based innovative textiles and materials from the past event that Algae Studio did. It was an event on rethinking fashion in bioeconomic material and clothing. And yeah, tonight we want to focus on the symbiosis with nature. And that brings me already to our topics. So Jemma Battaglia is going to reimagine fashion with a speculative lens with her speculative design project, Pollutus Planta. And this is a multimedia project which is aimed to provoke the viewer into thinking about the air pollution around them. So she's using speculative design to answer today's challenges in the fashion industry. And then Rasa Weber from Blond and Bieber. She'll take a more practical direction and talk about Algae Futures. So she's going to shine a light on unexplored qualities of a material which is in Europe still regarded mostly as weeds. And she's going to highlight the potential of microalgae as pigment for textile printing. Yeah, and now a little intro into our speakers themselves. Jemma is based in London, and she has an extensive fashion background focused on design. She's a specialist in alternative fashion practice, aligned with the concept of futuring to challenge the status quo of fashion. And Rasa is a research associate in Zurich, where she's pursuing a practice-based PhD in design right now. And she's also the co-founder of Blond and Bieber, which is a Berlin-based design studio, working with textile and product design. So that's it from my side for now. Thank you for listening. And this is where I'm handing over to Jemma.
Thank you, Annika. I just want to share my screen.
Yes.
1 second. Okay, you should be able to see it now.
Mm-hmm.
Can you see? Cool, great. Okay. Thank you for having me this evening. And thank you everyone for joining. At the end of this presentation, I'll be inviting you all to join me in an open discussion framed around the project that I'm going to be sharing with you shortly. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts and any questions you might have then. But firstly, before I share the project, I just wanted to share a tiny bit about my background and how speculative design has not only been a tool that has transformed my design practice, but has also given me a shift in mindset, which has enabled me to zoom out on what society is today and then zoom in on the aspects that I would like to make differently, more specifically to this talk, how I see fashion differently. There's a quote from the late David Graeber, an American anthropologist, that has stuck with me and is specific to this talk today. That is, the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it's something that we made and it could be made differently. And I think that's quite important to where we go with fashion in the future. So yeah, I've worked in the UK fashion industry as a women's wear designer for over 10 years, working with small circular fashion brands to large global retailers. However, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, I took the time of uncertainty to act upon my growing concern and frustration with the industry I was working in, and applied and was accepted onto a master's degree at London College of Fashion. The course was MA Fashion Futures, which I highly recommend to anyone considering to go and study a master's in fashion, as it totally shakes up your understanding of what fashion is and what it could be. I completed the course in January this year, so not that long ago. And the project I'm sharing with you today is part of what I did on the course. And it was the beginning of a concept that I went on to develop, which is futuring design, the concept of designing in symbiosis with nature. So let me just change the slide. So Pollutus Planta is placed within the concept of fashion and is framed around 3 mottos, which are to revamp hierarchies, structures and concepts, to relate the project to self and to communicate to an audience in a relatable way. And that part is for you to decide if I do that successfully. And finally, to rewire society to adopt, adapt and accept a reimagining of a concept, which specifically to this talk is solely focused on reimagining fashion. So just to go into a bit of background about the concept of futuring, I didn't want to talk too much today about where we are in fashion today, because I think that's quite widely shared across all platforms, and it's a big topic of conversation of what damage fashion is doing to the planet, to people, and how disconnected it is. So I wanted to focus on where it is now, but then quickly go into the future and concept. So sorry, let me just. So it's widely agreed that the planet is in an epoch of the Anthropocene, the era of humanity having impact on the planet. However, there is a environmental historian called Jason Moore who has renamed this to be the Capitalocene. So he's saying it's more specific to societies within all over the globe that are operating within capitalism. That is the foundation of a lot of the issues that place us into this epoch at the moment. I'm bringing this up because there's a quote from many years ago by Marx where he states that fashion is capitalism's favourite child. And I love this quote because it's still extremely relevant to today's system. So tackling fashion from just one area or another is never going to make the big change it needs. It's a whole systematic change needed. So this is where the futuring concept comes in, where I look at how we can reconnect people to nature and nature to people and create in symbiosis with nature. And I can go into more depth about some of the really interesting, there's a lot of academics writing at the moment around this topic that if anyone's interested, I can share with you at the end. I just wanted to show you this because this is what the question, this is based on the question that I wanted to ask at the end of the talk, which is, as it stands today, aesthetics is the top priority within fashion and fashion across fashion industry. We're all trying to create something that is aesthetically pleasing and is eye-catching and is going to get you the most likes on social media and all of that. But what if we were designing fashion that was triangulated within placing aesthetics within symbiosis with nature and the concept of futuring, which I will, after I share the project with you, may raise some questions, or you might be in disagreement with what I'm saying. There's two sides to the coin at the moment, where we never want to stall or stop creatives or new people coming into a creative process by placing some restraints, but then at the same time there needs to be a change to prevent any more damage being created through fashion. So yeah, I'll go into that later. So the Pollutus Planta project was a plausible speculative design project that was based around the future symbiosis of a genetically modified plant species and humanity. The project aimed to provoke the viewer into thinking about the air quality around them and using wearables as the medium to do this. Currently, London is one of the most air polluted cities in Europe, and it has a long history of being extremely toxic for its residents. This is why I chose this as the foundation of this project. But there are many reasons. Firstly, I live in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, which is reported to have the worst air quality in London. And secondly, on a global scale, fashion since industrialization has been one of the most biggest contributors to pollution, CO2 emissions and biodiversity damage, which has all impacted the air we breathe. And the European Public Health Alliance has predicted the air we breathe is only going to get far worse in the future. So there are already product developers working on air purifying masks, such as, oh, I'm just going to go to here, you see pictures. Yeah, there's already product developers working on air purifying masks, such as air atoms filter face mask. There's also a speculative design projects popping up all over the place, with the idea that humans will evolve in the future to survive the toxic air by nose hair growing very long out of our bodies to prevent any toxins being entered into the body, which I thought was quite scary and funny at the same time. Okay, so with that said, what if, on the contrary to Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest, nature evolves into survival as symbiosis, and more specifically through the mutualism of a genetically modified plant species named Pollutus Planta. This plant species has been modified to survive through the harvesting of humans' natural generated kinetic energy. And this is where the fashion aspect comes in, as you'll see in a second. The kinetic energy would be harvested through a suit that we wear. And as you can see from the screen that I'm sharing, the green parts are where the kinetic energy is at its highest. So we would be placing these genetically modified plants around these parts of our body to help purify the air we breathe. I'll just share with you. I just wanted to, as I'm saying, this whole concept and whole idea is through symbiosis. There's two prongs to this. So you have the suit that we wear, and then the genetically modified plant, which I'll show you here. So this plant is here. This is an abundance near where I live. The woolly lamb's ear plant. It's quite an interesting plant because I'm not sure if you can see, but there are a lot of tiny little hairs all over it. And these little tiny hairs actually do capture the pollutants in the air. So this is from just walks around where I live. This triggered the idea of, well, what if we genetically modified this plant and it could really purify the air around us when we wear it? Part of the project was to explore technologies. So for me to bring this whole speculative design idea to life, I was needing to use Arduino software, which is a wearable technology. Well, it's a micro technology that can be used as a wearable technology. And here I'm just sharing with you some of the early prototypes made out of just discarded, like used up notepads that I had around me and little paper clips, trying to create the look of this plant that would be opening and closing as we wear it. As the end result of this project was a film where a dancer was wearing the actual suit to bring this whole idea to life. I want to say at this point as well, this whole idea is, in my opinion, a dystopian future. I wouldn't like it to get to this point where we have to actually think about wearing something to help us breathe on the planet that we've evolved from. So yeah, as I went through more and more into developing the flower, I was looking at like biodegradable, compostable materials that I could use to create these flowers, which I found the Thermo works, where you can hand mold these into a flower and use the technology with it to create an opening and closing flowers. And this is just showing you how I was bringing it to life. So I had to use sensors that were put into the suit to create this flower that could open and close, and then code all of the software to be able to do this using the Arduino. And then here is the final result of the suit that I made with the flowers and the dancer. We went to Bow Roundabout, which is in London, near walking distance where I live, which is horrendously polluted, and you can actually see it in the air. It's not very nice, as you can see from the bottom picture. There's absolutely no nature in sight. It's all concrete, and it was a perfect place to really capture what this project was trying to share with its audience. And these are just some stills taken from the film. I can also share the link to the film if anybody would like to see the full thing. But it was just to give this dystopian idea of being in symbiosis with nature. Since doing this project is something that I see as an important part of the future of fashion. However, for me to get to that point, it came from this very dystopian idea. And you will see that in the film, that it's a very dark, abstract, very eerie film. But yeah, the link's here, so I can share that in the chat as well. And this is just a final presentation that I did with the film playing in the background. So yeah, that was the Pollutus Planta project. I wanted to ask a question to the audience, if anybody would like, well, and as well if you've got any comments. But after everything that I've shared with you today, what would fashion become if creativity was placed in the below framework, where, like I've shared with the Pollutus Planta project, it puts fashion in a different light, where it's not just about aesthetics, but it's also useful and helps us be more connected to nature. Do you see that as a good thing, a bad thing? Do you think fashion has no place being in that realm? But yeah, but I just would like to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Jemma. I'm going to give you the right to unmute yourself. So if you have something to share, please just speak into the crowd. Rasa, I think I see you lift your hand.
Yeah, I would like to thank you, Jenna, for presenting your work. I think there's also some comments in the chat.
Oh,
I just saw it. Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the term symbiosis, because it seems so prevailing for your work. And I'm very sorry, but I need to, my academic heart is arching at cleaning up a little bit on the question of Darwin. I think he cannot do anything about it. The idea of symbiosis, or the question of survival of the fittest, is definitely a relevant one in the design discourse today, but it goes back to neo-Darwinism. So not to Darwin himself, but to a discussion between neo-Darwinists and Lynn Margulis, the biologist who brought up the concept of symbiogenesis, so a different form of evolutionary thinking. And this brings me maybe back to a question that I have to you, because what I see in your design approach is almost like an antithesis, as you also said, of symbiosis with nature, or symbiogenetic evolution. And I think the question that you also posed to the audience, what happens if you turn this around? And perhaps now, being at the end of your project, can you give an outlook into what would the symbiotic view be in fashion for you?
So this, when I went and did this project, I didn't realize, I wasn't coming at it from fashion being in symbiosis with nature. It was kind of, as I was researching it, that became the outcome, and it became the beginning of my next phase, where since then I have been working in symbiosis with nature, where I'm creating, hang on, let me try and put this in the right way. So here I've challenged myself throughout the whole project, because I think the concept of it is this weird, twisted, dystopian idea of us still genetically modifying and not being in a natural state of symbiosis with nature. But also, following this project, I then started to develop how we could create materials, or we could generate certain products that are actually in a mutualism with nature. So where we create materials that gives back to the soil, for instance, which is one project that I'm currently working on, which is the eggshell project. It's taking natural food products and turning it into materials that can be then returned to composting. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question correctly, but I just wanted to give you a journey of how I got here.
Okay, so Ben, you asked for the cornerstones of the diagram as well. I just want to bring it back to the question of Jemma before we move on to our next talk. Ben, do you have an idea after, look, you got the answer, right, for futuring aesthetics and making? Maybe.
Yeah, I did. Sorry, but I'm multitasking and parenting. So I don't have anything intelligent, but I'm just digesting while my kid's in the bath and listening. So sorry, nothing super smart.
No, all right.
But thanks for sharing.
Okay, all right. Okay, cool. I think I also really like what Kate is saying here. It feels like we will need in the future fashion for survival. I was thinking in general, if we try to move our focus from aesthetics to, let's say, creativity. I was thinking about how aesthetics is not that important, let's say, if we're also focusing on function, or if there's a big story behind it, right? I guess also creativity would be something like that. Like there's a story behind even just those sensory socks that I showed you earlier. They were not about aesthetics. They were about the function that they had, and this is how aesthetics were less important. This is just what I was thinking about, how if we want to have a shift of priority from aesthetics to, let's say, creativity, also like how can fashion be more solution oriented instead of just a beautiful item that we're wearing? I guess we would have to focus on its function. They would have to be, I guess, even if you look at Balenciaga or fashions like this, you wear it not because it's maybe even aesthetic, just because it has this certain story that it's portraying, right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, let's say, what is it? I forgot the name of the brand. Everyone wears it. It's just Patagonia. People are wearing this because it's the most aesthetic thing, maybe, but more because of the integrity behind the brand. Mm-hmm. Just some thoughts that I was having. Leah, do you maybe want to share what you said in the chat?
Hello, can you hear me, or is it weird with them? Yeah, actually, I was also working on something like this on my bachelor thesis, and I joined some panels about bioethics, and I think it's like a really interesting way of thinking about it, as like genetically modifying is always like the way of thinking, like taking the bio approach into the future fashion, like thinking of cloud plants and thinking of algae and thinking about like all the different medium you can take from bio, like from biology, but actually, you always need to have like this, genetically modifying approach in the lab to turn it into the industry. And then I think it's really important to think, further, like if it's like really necessary and where do we want to go with that, like in one sense of like we're not taking plastics anymore, but in the end we're taking all this biolabbing, genetically modifying thinking into that. And I actually question myself where it's going from there. And I didn't answer myself that question until now. Did you hear me, or is it?
Yeah.
And there's like, from Leiden University in the Netherlands, they have some lectures about this. There's one teacher, he's doing specific stuff about bioethics, but I didn't look into that further yet.
I think it's a really interesting topic for sure. But with bioethics, I mean, there's so much work to be done around bioethics and ethics in general in fashion, to be honest, but that's a whole other topic. There is so much, it's very difficult.
I think someone want to say something, like René Kriegler.
Yeah, hello. I was wondering if you think about the adaptation of this fashion, if it's less about, if it wouldn't be less about aesthetics, but more about something that's emotional and more appealing. So the emotions that I saw triggered by what you showed was a lot about actual fear. Yeah, so I wanted to run away. I don't want this because it felt a bit dystopian, to be honest. And I wonder if there could be a combination of the sustainability and of the fashion with a emotionally more appealing thing, something that I find sympathetic, that I really want to wear. That was the missing aspect, I thought, and I think we can't really expect fashion to be adapted without that.
Yeah, thank you, René. Okay, I would say, Sophie, you have the last word, and then we're going to move to the next topic.
Thank you, Annika. I actually just had one thought. So I also have a background in fashion design, and this whole discussion about aesthetics, I mean, marketing plays a big role in this as well, right? And PR. So, I mean, there's so many trends, so many things that people design that at the first look seem absolutely outrageous. But once you put them on the right person, the right celebrity, people get used to it as well, right? And things that we considered unaesthetic 10 years ago, 20 years ago are suddenly aesthetic now. So I wonder how much of that is just good PR, good press, getting used to certain aesthetics, how much that will actually play a role as well. I mean, we're all wearing masks now. We've all gotten so used to it that sometimes we don't even really see them anymore, right? I mean, okay, a mask is like a tiny detail compared to having to wear something that helps you breathe or clarifies the air for you, but I wonder what role all that will actually play concerning aesthetics.
Yeah, very true. Thank you, Sophie. That's a good final word. And I think we will have time in the Q&A to maybe explore this further. I'm just going to make a cut here So any thoughts that you have for this, like remember them, note them down now, and then we can go back to it also in the Q&A. But yeah, so at this point now, I'm going to hand over to Rasa. So yeah, thank you so much, Jemma, for your talk, and we're going to see each other again in the Q&A.
Jemma, if you don't mind, would you unshare your screen? Otherwise, I cannot share mine. Thank you. So there we go. Would you give me a sign that you see my screen now? Yes, good.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, thanks for the invitation, for having the chance to speak at Speculative Futures Berlin. I am a designer, so I'm actually not from the fashion realm, but I'm educated as a product designer. As mentioned before, I am now teaching at Zürcher Hochschule der Künste and pursuing a PhD on the intersection of material research and design on the topic of the ocean. And that's perhaps not so far away from this project, which is by now almost 10 years old. 2013, we started with the algae research, and that's quite interesting. And why do I say this? Because the fashion industry changes fast in some parts, and in other parts, it seems to be really slow because the pressing issues have not changed in the past 10 years. We still are at a point where we are desperately looking for alternatives for textile production. I collaborate with Johanna Glomp, who is a textile designer under the studio name Blond and Bieber. And as I said, we started in 2013 and did a number of projects that deal with sustainable pigments, recycling of materials, and the reuse of biomaterials mainly. And we see our practice really at an intersection of collaborative research with scientific institutions, and we look into color as a form of looking into materials in the laboratory. And that means a lot of experimentation and also failure. That means we are testing a lot together with scientific institutions, see what works, what doesn't work, and try to translate these findings into concrete scenarios. That means I feel almost a little bit lost in the speculative realm because we try to be as non-speculative as possible. We try to realize pieces that give at least an idea of where this could go to in an applied realm of the industry. So coming back to the two statements that we heard a little bit earlier, yes, aesthetics cannot be the only criteria for deciding on fashion. We believe that color is not a trend. That means at the moment, color is widely seen as bound to different seasons in the fashion industry. And we wish for a different understanding of color as coming out of the necessities of the material. That means if you experiment with colors and pigments, you will find different necessities of these colors. And that means to some degree, you cannot decide what happens to the piece of fashion. On the other hand, I also agree with what was said before about fashion not being able to transform if there's no aesthetic dimension in it. And I always want to remind people that aesthesis is nothing but perception, and we only perceive what is interesting to us. And we have a lot of filters, especially in consumer habits. And that's why I believe in the narrative quality of design. That doesn't have to be a beautiful piece, but it has to be a well-communicated piece. And if the piece is not standard, you have to understand as a consumer why it is different than expected. But coming back to the prevailing problems that we still face, the textile industry is an extremely dirty industry. We all know that, and that's nothing new. But the shocking fact is that it doesn't change as quickly as we thought it would be. And this is a very current photo, 1 year old, taken by Greenpeace from a river on the Philippines next to textile industries. And what you can see is that it's still a very wasteful and full of chemical industry. And if you ask people in that area what color is trend in that season, they might just answer, take a look at the river, because you will see the pigments and the chemicals are washed into the river every day. So there's a lot to be done still. And we start as a design studio at the smallest component, and that means experimentation on the material with different forms of natural pigments that we catalog, also as a form of an archive. So if we collaborate with other industry partners, we would always do tests together with them and catalog these tests in order to have a repository of knowledge to go back to and to understand the longer impact of our tests. We started our work in 2013, as I said, right at a moment where there was a huge algae plague happening on the coast of Qingdao. We know that algae are proliferating under conditions that are usually harmful for the environment. So acidification, warmer temperature, all these factors go into the growth of algae and actually affect it in a, you could say, positive or negative way, where it grows more. And these photos show clearly that our cultural perception of algae in Western Europe is very much framed as this disgusting material. Perhaps we have seen it on our plates when we ate sushi, but we definitely never found it aesthetic and never wanted to be in touch with it. Whereas in China, it's perceived as a healthy material that is actually good for your skin. So people covered their body in the algae and wanted to interact with it. And that sort of showed us that there is a possibility in design to trigger these shifts in thinking, in having different modes of filtering cultural assumptions. And that's what alchemy is trying to do. It tries to give us the opportunity to, so to speak, wear new glasses and look at material in a different way. Our research started at the Fraunhofer Institute, which is an independent research institute in the area of Stuttgart. And they are focusing on microalgae research in these bioreactors that you can see on the right. They mainly look into fuel production. They want to research the lipids, the oils of the algae for fuel and food. And we were interested in looking at the species from different angle, basically. And what was very surprising for us, we found deep freezed algae samples at this institute. And we were so surprised to see the different range of colors that these algae bring. So they are not green as expected, they are also green, but they are also blue, yellow, red. So each species of algae brings along a different color spectrum. And we were totally fascinated by that and wanted to experiment with it. And we didn't know at that time what it would turn into. So we took the material to our studio and started color tests. So we really printed with the single cells on different undergrounds, so on materials such as cotton, silk, later on leather also, and developed this color spectrum that just came out of the species without manipulating anything, just seeing what the species would give us, basically. And after being quite satisfied with the first results, we tried around with translating this into a collection of textiles. And these textiles, from a design perspective, tried to pick up the idea of the algae on the micro and macro level and translate it into the shapes that we printed with. So, but for us also, as I said, the narrative dimension of understanding material is quite important. So we decided to develop an analog printer. And the goal was to show to a public audience how easy it is to grow algae and how you transform the biomaterial into a textile print in different steps. So it starts with the breeding of the algae, which is quite easy. So bioreactors do nothing more than we do here in the analog printer. It makes material circulate. It adds CO2 to the mixture, and it needs sunlight to grow. And that's basically all the components that are needed for having proliferating growth of algae. So feeding is the second step with the CO2. Then we filter the algae through cotton cloth, and this technique we learned by looking at the Congolese tradition of filtering spirulina algae, because on one of the lakes in Congo, they do that. They just filter algae through cotton cloth and use it as food. We do mixed algae with different textile binders, and we later on print with a printing wheel. I'm going to show you how it works.
Oh, 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 oh. Oh, 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 oh. Oh, 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 oh. Death, she must have been your will, a born beneath the reaper's veil. With your voice my belly sung, and I began to feel so drunk. Candle, candle on my clock. Oh Lord, I must have heard you knock me out of bed as the flames licked my head and my lungs filled up black in their tiny little shack. It was real and I repent. All those messages you sent, clear as day, but in the night, oh, I couldn't get it right. Oh, 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 oh. Oh, 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 oh. Oh, 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 oh.
So as you can see, sense of fashion changes over a period of time. I wouldn't wear these shoes anymore today. So for us, of course, it was interesting since we found this incredible possibility of printing with algae to translate it into applicable scenarios for the industry, because I personally believe people cannot imagine what can be done until they see how it's done. That means we wanted to create as many different scenarios as possible to see different forms of using this algae. So we collaborated with different fashion designers. In that case, it's Elenia Gortana, a Berlin-based fashion designer, and the shoe company Trippen, which does CO2 neutral leather shoes. And we made a first collection that illustrates the potential of using these pigments on different undergrounds. So for us, the collaborative practice is key to understanding future scenarios and how to translate potential futures into actual industrial products. Another example for this was created a little bit later on commission of Goethe Institute in Los Angeles in collaboration with Keraco, which is a textile research company. And they have produced, they found us via Alchemy, and they produced a pigment from the leftovers of the blackcurrant juice production. So it's actually the peel of the blackcurrant berry that we tried to apply to new scenarios. And they didn't know what to do with that pigment. So we started first tests in the laboratory as well as in our studio to see how potent this pigment actually is. On the left, you see wash fastness tests with different silks. And on the right, you see attempts to dye wood and cotton with it. And the project was a collaborative fashion project curated by curator Quinn Tran with a number of Berlin-based fashion studios such as Vladimir Karalev, Schmidt Takahashi, Michael Sonntag, to name them. So we collected 6 different fashion designers and we reinvented their collection with our sustainable pigments. And in the fashion show in LA, we also try to do new forms of intervention, which means we wanted to illustrate how these natural pigments actually work and how much impact they can have. Because usually people think that natural pigments are kind of nice, but they all turn out brown in the end, which is not true. So in this fashion show, we actually dyed the shoes, the sole of the shoes, live on stage. It was a goal for us to use all the pieces of the collection. So the cut-offs of the collection went into a collaboration with Vladimir Karalev on the last piece here, where we actually collected all the bits and pieces that were not used in the sewing process into a final piece of clothing. That was done by Swarovski, the dress. I'm going to jump over this film in respect of the time and talk about emotionally durable design. And I think that links very well to the discussion we had before. For us as designers, it's relevant to say that having an impact in the industry means that people have to emotionally connect to it. The term emotionally durable design comes from Jonathan Chapman, who says waste is symptomatic for failed relationships. So in his kind of way, in Chapman's kind of way, speaking about sustainability means speaking about an emotional relationship that you can establish to a piece of clothing. And I always like to bring up the example of the jeans, which perhaps already has a hole in it. So the decision is keep it or throw it away. And I would say the argument for keeping it is that you have a personal story that relates you to these jeans, perhaps your first festival, or perhaps your first kiss. So emotional durability is something that we as designers can also try to help shape in the course of our work with narrative design strategies. The stories that we tell help to make products last longer. And I think that's eventually the goal. And I don't believe that biodesign or biological material per se helps to create a better fashion industry. I do believe that a different relationship to fashion items can. And this kimono, for me, is the best example to talk about sustainable fashion, because it's a fashion piece that fits for any type of body, for any gender, and it can be inherited. So usually a kimono would be inherited from grandparents to their children or grandchildren. The kimono has a collar that can be taken off and replaced. And actually, as I said before, fits any type of body. So it actually survives over generations. And I think that's what we as designers eventually want to arrive at a culture where pieces are not just thrown away as quick as possible, but where they actually have again, or reintegrate again, a generational aspect in thinking about design. In the last year, we collaborated with Volleybag, an outdoor company that wanted to make an experimental form of t-shirt. This t-shirt is done by bamboo, and it's printed with algae. And the idea was to have a biodegradable piece. So a piece that would just disappear after a period of time if you throw it on the compost. It's the antithesis to what I just said. It's the reverse version of, at least if you throw it away, it should not leave a trace on Earth. And it always reminds me of the Buddhist saying, what has been gathered will be dispersed, what has been accumulated will be exhausted, what has been built up will collapse, and what has been high will be low. Because we as designers cannot decide how long pieces will stay on planet Earth. We know that nothing lasts forever. And to sum up and have a little bit of an out view of what I'm working on right now, the questions of biodesign and the problems and limits of it brought me to my current thesis, Growing Matter, where I'm actually researching on growing material processes in maritime environments, more focused on architecture, but also with the specific idea of using yarns as a material for creating symbiotic forms of growth towards new forms of understanding architecture as a collaborative form of making. And I do believe that this can be transferred also to the fashion realm. The question of how can we collaborate on new forms of making, of growing materials. And I would like to end with this and open the discussion to you, because I said from the project Alchemy, I have some learnings that I would like to share, but maybe I just open the stage and ask you, what do you think are the limits of biodesign? Where are we facing problems when applying biological material? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rasa. Super interesting. I'm very curious to hear what the answers are from everyone. So just unmute. I think you can unmute yourself again. Yeah, but before anyone says anything, really, really interesting also to see it live in action, to see the collections actually appearing on the runway. And also, I think it's a really cool idea to have this, to showcase the actual act of dyeing right there and then for everyone to see. Yeah, it's super powerful. Okay, everyone, feedback. What are the limits of biodesign? Or maybe, Rasa, you can give a first feedback on some of the findings that you had, maybe that will inspire others.
I will give you a hint. I will show you a photo. And I think the photo could spark a discussion. Once again, what are the limits of biodesign? What is sustainability? To embed this is an algae plant in New Mexico, from photo from last year. Yes, Niels.
Okay, I think it wraps up very nice the two talks, because on the first talk we heard about fashion as the favorite child of capitalism, and when you see this picture, it's the it's the picture for that that quote. So yeah, I think as always the question is how much is enough, and what I find quite interesting is that you both started about thinking about different forms of fashion from the negative side. You saw the pollution in the dyeing process. On the other hand, the air pollution intrigued to think about different kinds of fashion. And what I find quite interesting is how could you turn this around with the things you developed, with the fashion you developed, with the techniques you developed, and think about what could evolve from that without the negative aspect on the back of your mind. So that, yeah, just a small input.
I think I can directly answer to this, Niels. For me, the point of departure is no reason for not sparking different forms of future images. And I do believe the whole project is an answer to the question of what could evolve from this, because the departing point brought us into experimenting with a new form of material. But I agree, yes, that forms of consumerism and capitalism feed back to the discussion of sustainability or future of fashion in general. And for me, the prevailing question is the question of scalability. So what is scalable? What ideas are scalable? Because if you look at it from the hard point of view, from the industry, that's the first question that you will be asked. Like, how much meters can you produce? And I can tell you, I got requests from Chinese producers that wanted to do this in kilometers. So the question is, how much is enough, and what are solutions that actually give valuable answers? And I do believe locality can be a track to follow on this, because local questions are always affecting the fashion industry, and they should do more. So some materials might apply to certain areas, algae perhaps good in certain environments, but perhaps not good everywhere. Maybe there's different pigments in other areas of the world. And then you look into the fashion industry differently, because then you would say, well, local clothing is just produced in a certain area for a certain clientele, for example. And that could be one part of the puzzle. But I think there's, of course, many more questions that you could raise. Is there any other ideas on the question of the limits of biodesign?
Yeah.
Resources, yeah.
I totally agree with the idea. I think where the future of fashion could go is with multiple centres. So like fashion at the moment is such a global, worldwide, and when you talk about localism, it scares a lot of people off because they think, well, that's not how business is done. But what if it's reshaped with multiple centres rather than one, which all of those multiple centres are then adapted to the local environment, local people, local aspects of people's cultures and everything. Like, it's not about being anti-globalist, it's looking at it in a very different way, where you can have I keep saying multiple centres because that's what's used in this theory of Earth logic with Kate Fletcher, which you should definitely read. But it's kind of, if you haven't, but it's basically saying we need to look at localism as not anti-globalist. It's looking at creating and making that works with your local environment, and your business can then be, well, I mean, I suppose it's very similar to how Speculative Futures is set up. You've got all these different centres that are all aimed at the local like surroundings. Fashion kind of needs to be shaped in that kind of way rather than be globalist from just one place. I think that's a positive idea.
A second thought on this, or a second piece of the puzzle is what I would call education of your clientele, and that means not forcing them to do something, but explaining the story behind the origin of things. And with alchemy, I didn't mention this talk, but alchemy colors actually change over a period of time. So they don't stay green, but green changes to blue, for example. And in a discussion with the industry, of course, this is always highlighted as a huge problem. I mean, light fastness is the thing that you have to prove in order to be able to produce for a big market. We twisted this narrative, and for example, Volleybag is a great reference to this, because Volleybag is a very daring company, let's say. So they're really reshaping their whole fashion ethics alongside the idea of introducing new materials, and they really are open for this. And when they approached us, we were like, yeah, you know, we always have this discussion in the beginning, you know that our colors are changing. So if you produce something with us, it might not look the same in a year's time. They were like, yeah, no, that's amazing. We'll just tell the story to the clients. And it actually worked. So people are accepting this as long as you make it transparent and explain why, because then you can actually have a new form of relation to the piece. Maybe it's interesting that it changes. Maybe it's interesting that the t-shirt is blue after a year's time, not green anymore. Just need to know why. And I think this form of education of consumers is something that can also be a leverage point to change consumer habits. Mani, you wanted to say something?
Hi everyone. Great talks, both of you. Thank you. So a concern would be like an unintended consequence of using something like algae is it's so reliant on land, right? So it's so reliant on surface area. It's also super reliant on fresh water as well. And it grows best, or is cultivated best in like really hot countries, so around the equator as well. So then what you're looking at is farming going on in equatorial countries, like towards the global south. You're looking at massive uses of resources, natural resources, water especially, which isn't necessarily going to be abundant in those places, and especially going forward in the next few decades. And I mean, there's definitely like a risk of, to do this at scale, unintended consequences. It's going to be the same kind of destruction level as agriculture is now if people are not very careful. Yeah, I think this is like fundamentally the human condition, is like they feel like they have the answer to everything and they jump on it and then they don't look at what could potentially come from that. So dealing with a lot of this stuff at scale, I think some similar issues with stuff like hemp, not so much with mycelium, but yeah, a lot of these materials aren't necessarily going to be scalable in a safe or sustainably productive way, I think. What do you think? Am I wrong?
Yeah, I think you summed it up super nicely. It's precisely the questions that I would ask myself now looking at the project. The question, I mean, there's no such thing as one material that could heal the fashion industry, and there's no such thing as one solution that fits all. And that's what I wanted to refer to when I talked about localities, because certain solutions might work for a certain environment, but not on a global level. And that frightens us as we are used to global solutions at the moment. But these fundamental questions have to be raised. And I mean, I have to mention it now, but with the crisis that we are facing at the moment and the crisis of resources that we are also facing that come up as a consequence, it becomes crystal clear that things are just out of balance. And we also see already that this affects the fashion industry. So this radical impact that the momentary situation has on all economical levels has to be taken into account. And we cannot just say, well, if we do it in a biological way, it will just become better. No, it doesn't. It's a fundamental societal question that we have to ask. Yes, so I think your comment is very great and sums it up very good.
Also, if I may, I feel like a lot of the transportation and a lot of the additional carbon elements that people factor into the calculations when they're talking about fashion in its current state will still be applicable even if you're using algae, because it still needs to get transported around the world, right? And algae potentially like could work as a weed if it gets into like local water systems and stuff, and just take over and be really destructive in that sense also. I think it's awesome, but I definitely think it's worth exploring the dangers of.
Maybe as a very specific last comment on the situation of algae, there's one particular case where it makes totally sense to use microalgae, and that is to connect algae plants to other plants. So if you have an industrial site, it produces a lot of CO2. Algae plants or bioreactors are a great way of filtering the air. So if they're directly connected to that industry locally, you can actually grow a material by, in the same time, altering the air quality with the specimen. And I think that's one of the cases where it really makes sense to implement algae plants.
Does that contaminate algae?
No, the algae are happy about CO2. That's what they feed off. Well, yeah, I think perhaps I hand it over to you again, Annika.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you. I just had also found like another limit maybe. I think with anything that's sustainable design, or if you look into production and material, of course, fashion is like a systemic, is a system. So when you're looking at ways of finding better ways of producing, that's one thing. But that's the whole problem with scaling, right? If we're producing for the same demand or with the same consumption that we face right now, I guess that would be a big limit as well. Just like to sum that up. And I don't know, like I guess that's also the whole educate. I don't know how we tackle that. That's like one of the biggest questions, I think, how we change that, the way we even consume fashion. If anyone has an idea, let me know. But I would say yeah, are there any more questions then, more feedback to the speakers? You can ask Jemma directly, Rasa. Now is your time to shine. You can also just drop it in the chat box if you're feeling shy. People are getting hungry and tired from a long day.
I was thinking the same thing. I think people are hungry.
Well, you guys maybe have a question for each other.
I just wanted to say that how fascinated I am with the idea of using algae. Is there something that can be, at the moment I see from the projects that you're working with in collaboration to get the actual material so you can dye and use the algae as a dye, but is there something that can be done that actually creates materials from algae, or is that not a possibility? This is an area that I have no idea.
There is a possibility. It's not my research focus, but I would have to look up how the studio is called. I know that there was a Dutch design studio a couple of years ago exhibiting at Eindhoven Design Fair, and they showed how to make plastics from microalgae. So they had a 3D printing process that apparently worked. And of course, there can be stuff done in the realm of food. Yeah, future foods, and that sounds very fancy, but actually there's also a huge need for that. So the UN is researching into food supplements for 15 years now, and they were the first to come up with ideas of having this as a resource to grow in Congo to have additional food resources. Yeah, because it's very nutritional. It might not taste so good, but actually I tried several times.
I would be interested to try, yeah, for sure. Yeah, it is fascinating. I think there's so much research going on at the moment in terms of using alternative materials, like it was mentioned earlier about mycelium and things like that, and I think it is fascinating, but again, it doesn't work. None of this works in the current system because, like we've just been speaking about, it can't be a replacement for this overconsumption of fashion. It's the very idea of fashion
today as it is consumed and how global and fast paced and changing it is. All has to be broken down and flipped, and our idea of what we wear needs to change, I think.
I posted the algae polymer link in the chat for those.
Oh, amazing. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you so much, Rasa and Jemma, for sharing tonight, sharing your projects and everything you're working on. And to everyone that is still here, that hasn't run off to dinner, thank you for your input and your feedback, your questions. I hope you had a good evening with us, and there's always something that you can take away from it. And we are definitely going to be posting this online as well if there's something you want to look back on. And maybe, for example, Rasa, you can share the video maybe with me that you skipped because of time, then I can still send a link to everyone afterwards. And yeah, okay. Thank you so much for joining tonight, and have a good evening further.